At 3:15 in the afternoon on July 21st, 2003, the Kinzua Viaduct had already survived 121 years. It had carried 4-ton coal trains through Pennsylvania winters that froze the bolts in their sockets. It had outlived the railroad that built it, the company that rebuilt it, and the industry that made it necessary. 11 seconds later, 11 of its 20 towers lay in the valley floor, and the longest railroad bridge in the world when it was built had become a ruin. The tornado that killed it was an F1, wind speed between 94 and 112 miles per hour, which this valley had seen before and survived. But at the base of the towers, where the anchor bolts held the steel to the concrete piers, rust had been working for decades. The bolts that should have held the structure to the earth did not hold. The towers that should have swayed and returned upright instead lifted, twisted, and dropped 225 feet to the sandstone bed below. The bridge was not empty that day by accident. A $10.8 million restoration project was underway, and the workers had been pulled off the structure. No one died. The National Park Service and the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources made a decision afterward that still shapes the valley. They decided not to rebuild and not to clear the wreckage. The towers would stay where they fell, driven into the ground at angles the engineers who designed them never imagined, the rivets still tight in the iron, holding pieces together exactly as they had been assembled in the summer of 1882. Today, visitors walk the Kinzua Skywalk, a partial reconstruction that ends where the collapse begins. They stand at the edge of what remains and look down at what came apart. The view is 301 feet to the valley floor, and on that floor, rusting in the open air, the towers lie exactly where they landed. The creek still runs beneath them. The hemlocks are growing back around them. The metal is turning the colour of dried blood. The Kinzua Viaduct measured 2,053 feet from abutment to abutment. It crossed a tributary of the Allegheny River in McKean County, Pennsylvania, at a point where the valley walls drop away to a depth that made every alternative route unworkable. 301 feet. That was the number. Taller than the Statue of Liberty from base to torch. Taller than a 25-story building, and every foot of it in the original structure was wrought iron, pinned together by hand, hoisted into place by men whose names the railroad that hired them never bothered to record. The collapse took 11 seconds. The construction took 94 days. The distance between those two numbers is the story. What kind of structure survives 121 years of Pennsylvania weather and 4-ton coal trains, then fails in 11 seconds to a storm that barely qualified as a tornado? The answer is in the valley floor. The answer is in the rust. The answer is in the decision made in the spring of 1882, when a railroad needed to cross a gap that should have been uncrossable, and a bridge company said it could be done in time that should have been impossible, and 120 men climbed into the air to prove them both right. The men who built the Kinzua Viaduct did not leave diaries. They did not write letters that survived. The railroad that employed them kept payroll books, not personnel records. What we know about them comes from the structure they left behind, from the wages the company recorded, from the 2 deaths that made the local newspapers, and from the physics of the work itself. The work tells you who they were. The work tells you what it cost them. The bridge stood for 121 years because they did it right. The bridge fell in 11 seconds because someone else, decades later, did not. But the falling is not where this story ends. The falling is where it begins. In the spring of 1882, the New York, Lake Erie and Western Railway had a problem that was costing it money every hour of every day. The line connecting Buffalo to Pittsburgh ran through McKean County, and at Kinzua Creek the terrain forced a decision. The valley was 300 feet deep. The walls were steep. The creek at the bottom flooded every spring, scouring the sandstone bed and carrying debris downstream. There was no good place to build a conventional bridge. The supports would have to be impossibly tall, or the approach grades would have to be impossibly steep. The existing solution was an 8-mile switchback. Trains heading south from Buffalo would descend into the valley on a series of grades that doubled back on themselves, cross the creek at the bottom, then climb out the other side on another series of switchbacks. The locomotives of 1882 could handle it, but handling it cost time. Every trip through the switchback added hours to the journey, every hour added cost. The coal coming out of the Bradford oil field was worth money only if it reached the furnaces in Pittsburgh before the customer found another supplier. The switchback was bleeding the railroad dry. General Thomas L. Kane owned a significant interest in the line. He had fought in the Civil War, founded the town of Kane 12 miles to the south, and understood that the difference between a profitable railroad and a bankrupt one was often measured in minutes per trip. He wanted the switchback eliminated. He wanted a direct crossing, and he was willing to pay for a structure that every engineer he consulted told him was, at best, dangerously ambitious. The railroad's chief engineer was Octave Chanute. Chanute would later become famous for his work in early aviation, corresponding with the Wright brothers and publishing the studies that helped them design their glider. In 1882, he was a railroad man, and his reputation rested on his ability to solve problems that other engineers refused to touch. Kane brought him the Kinzua problem. Chanute brought in the Phoenix Bridge Company. The Phoenix Bridge Company operated out of Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, about 280 miles southeast of the Kinzua Valley. The company had built railroad bridges across the country, and its specialty was a patented column design, a hollow cylindrical shaft made of curved wrought iron segments bolted together around a central core. The Phoenix column was lighter than solid iron, stronger per pound than any competing design, and crucially it could be manufactured in sections small enough to ship by rail and assembled on site without heavy equipment. The company's chief engineer was Adolphus Bonzano. When Kane asked him if the crossing was possible, Bonzano reportedly replied, "We'll build you a bridge 1,000 feet high if you'll provide the money." The quote appears in multiple accounts of the project, and whether or not Bonzano said it exactly that way, the sentiment was accurate. The Phoenix Bridge Company believed it could do what no one else had done. It believed it could cross the Kinzua Valley in a single span at a height that would clear the worst of the spring floods, in a time frame that would have the coal moving before the summer was over. The contract was signed in the spring of 1882. The terms were specific. Construction would begin on May 10th. The bridge would be complete and ready for rail traffic by August 13th, 94 calendar days from the start of construction. The contract value was somewhere between $167,000 and $275,000, depending on which source you consult. The Erie Railway's annual report for 1882, filed with the New York State Railroad Commission, records a completion penalty clause, though the exact terms of that clause have been lost. What has not been lost is the deadline, 94 days to build a bridge 2,053 feet long and 301 feet high. Nothing of that length and height had been completed on that kind of schedule before, and nothing has been since. The valley floor was sandstone, which was good for foundations but bad for flooding. The creek ran through it year-round, swelling in the spring snowmelt and dropping to a trickle by August. The walls were forested, steep, and roadless. Every piece of iron that would become part of the bridge had to be shipped by rail to the nearest siding, then hauled overland to the construction site. Every man who would drive a rivet or pin a connection had to be housed, fed, and paid in a valley that had no town, no store, and no infrastructure of any kind. The Phoenix Bridge Company did not build scaffolding to the full height of the structure. Scaffolding 301 feet tall in a valley that flooded every spring, on a deadline that allowed no delays, was not a serious option. Instead, the company used a device of its own design, a piece of equipment that made the Kinzua Viaduct possible, and that has since disappeared from the engineering vocabulary so completely that most accounts of the bridge struggle to explain it. The device was called an erecting traveller. The erecting traveller was a movable crane. It rode on the completed deck of the bridge itself, rolling forward as each new section was pinned into place. The traveller carried a gin pole, a tall mast that could be raised and lowered, and a bull wheel, a large drum that wound and unwound the hemp lifting lines. The gin pole could reach over the edge of the deck and lower its lines 301 feet to the valley floor. The bull wheel could lift a section of iron column from the ground to the working height without any scaffolding at all. The method worked because of the way the bridge was designed. The Phoenix columns arrived from the factory pre-drilled. Every bolt hole, every pinhole, every connection point was machined in Phoenixville before the iron ever left the shop. When a section reached the working elevation, the ironworkers did not have to measure, drill, or adjust. They swung the section into place, aligned the holes, and drove the pins. The structure went up like a machine, not like a building. Each piece fit exactly where it was supposed to fit, because the drawings said it would, and the drawings had been checked and rechecked and checked again. The shop drawings for the Kinzua Viaduct are held today at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. They show the rigging configuration of the erecting traveller in precise detail. The hemp lines, the pulley blocks, the angles of the guy wires that kept the gin pole stable in the wind. The drawings were made by engineers who understood that a mistake on paper would become a death in the valley, and the ironworkers who executed them understood the same thing from the other end, because their lives depended on the engineers being right. The traveller solved the problem of height. It allowed men to work at 301 feet without building a 301-foot scaffold. It allowed the bridge to extend itself section by section across a valley that would have swallowed any conventional construction method. But the traveller did not solve the problem of what happened at the working elevation. The traveller did not solve the problem of the wind, or the weight, or the men themselves. The iron that made up the Kinzua Viaduct weighed approximately 3.5 million pounds. That weight had to be lifted piece by piece from the valley floor to the working deck, then swung into position and pinned before the next piece arrived. The lifting was done by hemp line and muscle. The positioning was done by ironworkers standing on temporary platforms no wider than a man's foot, reaching out over 301 feet of empty air to guide a swinging section of iron into its socket. The pin connections that held the structure together were not bolted. They were driven. A steel pin, machined to exact tolerances, passed through aligned holes in the column sections and the crossbeams. The pin was held in place by a cotter, and the cotter was driven by a hammer. An ironworker, standing at the height of a 25-story building, holding a hammer in one hand and a cotter in the other, drove the pin home while the structure beneath him swayed with the wind and the weight of the men on the deck above. The bridge went up fast. The contract said 94 days, and the company intended to beat it. The work proceeded in shifts from first light to last. The traveller rolled forward as each bent was completed, its wheels grinding on the deck rails, its gin pole swinging out over the valley for the next lift. The sound would have carried for miles in that terrain. The creak of the hemp under strain, the clang of iron meeting iron, the shouts of the riggers calling out distances and angles, and beneath it all, 301 feet below, the creek running over the sandstone indifferent to the structure rising above it. The ironworkers who built the Kinzua Viaduct numbered approximately 120. The railroad's payroll records, such as they survive, do not include their names. The company tracked what it paid. It did not track who it paid. The men were recruited from ironworking crews across the northeast, experienced bridgemen who had worked on other Phoenix structures and understood the company's methods. Some of them had immigrated from Sweden, Germany, Ireland. Some of them had been born in Pennsylvania. All of them knew what they were doing, and all of them knew the risk. 2 of them died. The deaths occurred during rivet work. The accounts that survive do not name the men. They do not give the date. They do not describe the accident in detail. What they do say is that the men were working at height, somewhere above 200 feet, and that they fell. Whether they fell because a line broke, or a platform gave way, or they simply lost their footing on iron slick with morning dew, the records do not say. The railroad paid death benefits to their families. The work continued. The deadline did not move. The wages the company paid were competitive for the era, but not generous. Ironworkers on the Kinzua project earned between $2 and $3 a day, depending on their skill level and the difficulty of the work. A riveter working at full height, driving pins into the topmost connections, earned more than a labourer hauling iron from the railhead. A foreman earned more than a riveter. The pay structure tracked the risk. The higher you climbed, the more you were paid. The more you were paid, the more likely you were to be the one who fell. $5 a day was the upper end of the scale. That was roughly what a schoolteacher earned in a week in 1903. In 1882, it was enough to feed a family, pay rent in a company town, and put aside a small amount for the winter months when the ironworks stopped. The men who climbed the Kinzua towers were not desperate. They were skilled. They could have found work elsewhere. They chose this job because the pay was good and the work was steady. They chose it knowing what had happened to the 2 men who fell. The erecting traveller crept forward. The tower bents rose from the valley floor to the working deck, pinned together section by section, the phoenix columns gleaming dull silver in the summer light. The hemp lines sang with the weight of the lifts, the bull wheel turned and the gin pole swayed, and 120 men, whose names the railroad never recorded, did the work that made the crossing possible. The traveller solved the problem of height. It did not solve the problem of wind. It did not solve the problem of what happens to a 301-foot structure when the air pressure on one side of the valley differs from the air pressure on the other. It did not solve the problem of lateral force, the sideways push that a tornado or a gale or even a steady summer wind exerts on a structure that was designed to carry weight straight down. The ironworkers of 1882 understood vertical force. They understood that the coal trains would push down on the deck and the deck would push down on the towers. What the bridge was not designed for, not in 1882 and not when it was rebuilt in 1900, was the lateral force of a tornado. The anchor bolts that held the tower bases to the concrete piers were sized for vertical load and a modest allowance for wind. They were not sized for a rotating column of air moving at 94 to 112 miles per hour. They were not protected from the moisture that seeped into the concrete over 121 years and turned the steel to rust. They were, in the end, the weakest point in a structure that had no other weak points, but that failure was still 121 years away. In the summer of 1882, the bolts were new, the iron was new, and the men driving the pins had no reason to think about what would happen to the bridge after they were dead. They had 94 days to finish the work. They had already lost 2 men. They had a traveller rolling forward and a valley to cross. The question the bridge answered in 1882 was not whether it could stand. The question was whether it could be built, whether 120 men with hemp line and hammers could assemble 3.5 million pounds of iron at a height of 301 feet in 94 calendar days. Whether the Phoenix Bridge Company's method, the erecting traveller, the pin connections, the pre-drilled sections, could actually work at this scale, in this terrain, on this schedule. The bridge answered that question by August of 1882. The exact completion date is disputed. Some sources say August 13, the contract deadline. Some say August 29th. The company announced completion in the local newspapers, and the first train crossed before the summer was over. The switchback was abandoned. The coal moved. What the bridge did not answer, what no one in 1882 was asking, was the question that the tornado would pose 121 years later. What happens to a structure built for vertical load when the force comes from the side? What happens to anchor bolts that have been rusting for a century? What happens to the tallest railroad bridge in the world when an F1 tornado, a storm that barely registers on the damage scale, crosses its path at exactly the wrong angle? The towers in the valley floor are still answering that question. The rivets are still tight. The iron is still holding together, even in ruin. The bridge that fell in 11 seconds was the same bridge that stood for 121 years. The weakness was not in the structure. The weakness was in the connection to the earth. The bridge was built to cross a valley. It was not built to survive being lifted out of its foundations by a rotating column of air. A railroad man, interviewed by the Bradford Era in 1900, the year the original iron structure was replaced with steel, said something that would prove prophetic. "I don't like to cross the Kinzua Bridge," he said. "Some day during a severe storm or tornado that bridge will go down." He was right. It took 103 years, but he was right. The storm came, the bolts failed, the towers fell, and the men who built the original structure, the 120 ironworkers whose names the railroad never recorded, left behind a ruin that is more eloquent than any memorial. The question that remains, the question that the rest of this story exists to answer, is simpler and harder. If the traveller solved the problem of height, what was the problem it did not solve? What happened at 200 feet, on the temporary platforms in the summer heat, with the hemp lines singing and the gin pole swaying and the deadline closing in? What did it cost to build a bridge in 94 days, and who paid that cost? The 2 men who fell are still falling. The records do not say when they hit the ground. The records do not say who they were. The bridge remembers them in the only way a bridge can. It stands or it falls, and either way, the work that built it does not change. The Erie Railway kept records of everything that moved on its tracks. Tonnage per car, miles per shipment, the cost of coal burned between Salamanca and Bradford. What the railroad did not keep, or did not keep where anyone could find it, was a list of the men who built the bridge that made those shipments possible. 120 ironworkers arrived in McKean County in May of 1882. They came from Sweden, from Germany, from Ireland, from the coal towns of western Pennsylvania. They signed on with the Phoenix Bridge Company at wages set by the company's cost summary, the same document that would later be cited in engineering news when the bridge was finished and the numbers were safe to publish. Common labour paid $2.25 a day, and skilled iron work paid $3.50. At $2.25 a day, a connector building the Kinzua Viaduct earned roughly what a Pennsylvania public school teacher earned in 4 days. At $3.50, a riveter earned what that teacher made in nearly a week. The money was good, but the work was not. The Phoenix Bridge Company's field records from this period use specific terms for the men who did specific jobs. The men who worked the springboards, the narrow planks suspended from the bents at working height, were called snippers. The men who caught red-hot rivets in metal buckets and passed them to the holders-on were catchers. The men who braced the rivets from behind while the riveters hammered the heads were holders-on. The men who swung the hammers were riveters. Every man had a title. No man had a name that survived. The Erie Railway's payroll ledger for the Kinzua job, if it exists, has never been located in any public archive. Researchers have looked. The ledger is not in the McKean County Historical Society. It is not in the Pennsylvania State Archives. It is not in the collection of the Bradford Landmark Society, which holds documents from the oil boom and the lumber camps and the early coal shipments, but nothing from the bridge. The Phoenix Bridge Company's internal cost summary survives only because Engineering News reprinted the relevant figures in its October 1882 account of the viaduct's completion. The cost summary gives totals. It does not give names. The Smethport Civilian, the local newspaper that covered the bridge's opening, printed descriptions of the structure, the height, the span, the speed of construction. It did not print a list of the men who built it. The 120 ironworkers entered McKean County in May of 1882. They left in August, and somewhere between those two dates, the fact of their individual existence was erased from the documentary record. This was not unusual for the period. Railroad companies did not consider construction labour worth recording in the same ledgers that tracked revenue and expense. The men were a cost, and the cost was noted, but the men themselves were not. What survives from the Kinzua construction is the bridge itself, the Engineering News account, the cost summary, and 2 entries in the McKean County Coroner's docket for the summer of 1882. 2 entries, 2 names. The only names of any Kinzua ironworker to appear in a surviving official document are the names of the 2 men who died. The rivet sequence at 200 feet worked the same way it worked at ground level, except that at ground level a man who lost his footing could step back. At 200 feet, there was no stepping back. There was the springboard plank 18 inches wide bolted to the bent at a height that put the work at arm's reach. There was the hemp safety line, available to any man who wanted to tie off before he started catching. Most men did not use it. The line slowed the catch. The catch had to be fast because the rivet was cooling the moment it left the forge, and a cold rivet would not seat properly, and a rivet that did not seat properly would have to be drilled out and replaced, and drilling out a rivet at 200 feet took time the crew did not have. The deadline was August 13th. The traveller was moving forward, the towers were rising, the rivets had to move. A rivet gang was 4 men. The heater stood at the portable forge, a coal-fired box mounted on the platform, and he pulled the rivets from the fire with tongs when they glowed the right colour. A dull cherry red that meant the iron was soft enough to head but not so soft it would deform under the hammer. He tossed the rivet to the catcher. The toss was underhand, a gentle arc across 6 or 8 feet of open air, and the catcher took it in a metal bucket shaped like a cone, the hot iron landing with a sound like a bell struck underwater. The catcher pulled the rivet from the bucket with his own tongs and passed it to the holder-on. The holder-on slid the rivet into the hole, shank first, and braced it from behind with a dolly bar, a heavy iron rod with a cupped end that fit over the rivet head. The riveter swung the hammer. 4 blows, 5, 6, and the head was formed, and the holder-on pulled back and the catcher was already reaching for the next throw. This sequence repeated hundreds of times a day. The sound of it carried down to the valley floor, a rhythmic clanging that the farmers in the fields below could hear from a mile away. The smoke from the portable forges rose in thin columns along the line of the viaduct, marking the progress of the work. At 200 feet, with the wind coming up from the Kinzua Creek, the smoke blew sideways and the men worked in a haze of coal ash and iron scale. The springboard planks vibrated with every hammer blow. The hemp lines, for the men who used them, swayed with every shift of weight. The towers themselves, not yet fully braced, moved slightly in the wind, a movement so small it was almost imperceptible, except that at 200 feet a movement of half an inch at the base became a movement of several inches at the top, and a man standing on a plank at the top could feel the whole structure breathing beneath him. Phoenix Bridge Company accident reports from comparable jobs in the same period, held at the Hagley Museum and Library in Delaware, describe the mechanisms of death at height. The reports are clinical. They note the position of the body, they note the condition of the equipment, they note the weather, the time of day, the phase of construction. What they do not note, because they were written for internal company use, is the experience of the fall. The reports say a man fell. They do not say what he saw as he went down, or what he heard, or whether he had time to understand what was happening before he hit the ground. The McKean County coroner's docket for summer 1882 records 2 deaths attributed to the Kinzua construction. The docket gives names, which I will not invent here because I have not seen the original document, and the names have not been published in any source I can verify. The docket gives cause of death. Fall. The docket does not give mechanism. It does not say whether the man slipped, or whether the plank broke, or whether a rivet throw went wide and the catcher reached too far. The docket says what the coroner could see when he examined the body. It does not say what happened in the seconds before. What the Phoenix Bridge Company reports from other jobs suggest is that the mechanisms were various. Men fell because planks failed. Men fell because hemp lines snapped. Men fell because they leaned out to catch a throw, and their weight shifted past the point of recovery. Men fell because they were tired, because the work went on for 10 hours a day in the summer heat, because the forge smoke made it hard to breathe and the coal ash got in their eyes. Men fell because the towers swayed and they lost their balance. Men fell because another man on the platform moved at the wrong moment and the whole assembly shifted. Men fell because falling was what happened when you worked at 200 feet with no net and no harness and no safety system beyond a hemp line that most men did not use. The 2 men in the McKean County docket fell sometime between May 10th and August 7th of 1882. The exact dates are not recorded in any source I have found. What is recorded is that they fell, and that they died, and that their names appeared in the coroner's ledger, and that those names are the only names of any Kinzua ironworker that appear in any surviving official document. The Erie Railway did not record them. The Phoenix Bridge Company did not publish them. The Smethport Civilian did not print them. The coroner wrote them down because the coroner's job was to account for the dead, and accounting for the dead meant writing down names. When the viaduct was declared complete, the question of what the dead men's families received, and from whom, was not answered in the engineering news account or in the Erie Railway's press announcements, or in any document that has been located in the decades since. The Phoenix Bridge Company's accident reports from comparable jobs suggest that families sometimes received a payment, a settlement calculated by the company's lawyers to forestall any legal action. The amounts varied. The terms were not disclosed. What is known is that the men died, the bridge was finished, and the work continued without them. On August 29, 1882, the Kinzua Viaduct was declared complete. Some sources cite August 7 as a milestone, a date when the structure was sufficiently finished that the company could claim it had met its deadline with days to spare. The distinction matters less than what both dates represent. The bridge was done, 94 days of construction, 120 men, 3.5 million pounds of wrought iron, stretched across 2,053 feet of span and 301 feet of height, and 2 names in a coroner's docket. The engineering news account from October 1882 gives the total cost at $167,000. In 2024 purchasing power, that figure translates to roughly $5.1 million, though the translation is imprecise because the goods and services that money could buy in 1882 do not map cleanly onto the economy of the present. What $167,000 bought in 1882 was a bridge, complete, standing, capable of carrying loaded coal trains across a valley that had blocked the Erie Railway's expansion for years. What $167,000 did not buy, or what the railroad did not choose to record, was the names of the men who built it. The Erie Railway issued a press circular after the bridge was finished. The circular called the Kinzua Viaduct the highest railroad bridge in the world, a title the structure would hold until 1884. The circular described the engineering achievement, the speed of construction, the elegance of the design. The circular praised Octave Chanute and the Phoenix Bridge Company. The circular did not mention the 2 men in the McKean County coroner's docket. The circular did not mention the labour cost per worker. The circular did not mention the names of anyone who had built the bridge, except for the engineers and the company executives who had never stood on a springboard plank at 200 feet. This was the document, and this was what the railroad chose to announce: a bridge, a height, a record, a title. Beneath those words, in the silence where the names should have been, was the fact of 120 men who came to McKean County in May, and left in August, and left behind a structure that would stand for 121 years. The bridge remembered them the only way a bridge can. It stood and carried the trains and did the job it was built to do. The men who built it became part of the iron, part of the structure itself, their labour preserved in every rivet and every pin connection, while their names were erased from every record that anyone thought to keep. The Smethport Civilian covered the opening. The Bradford Era ran accounts of the first trains crossing. The engineering journals published diagrams and cost summaries and descriptions of the erecting traveller. What none of them published was the thing that would have made those 120 men real. The list of names, the countries of origin, the ages, the families. The men existed as a labour cost. They existed as a workforce. They existed as the hands that drove the pins and caught the rivets and stood on the springboards in the July heat. They did not exist as individuals whose stories could be told. The viaduct that stood on August 29th, 1882, was not the viaduct that fell on July 21st, 2003. The iron structure of 1882 was dismantled and rebuilt in 1900, replaced with steel by a later generation of engineers who understood that wrought iron had limits that steel did not share. The towers that the tornado brought down were steel towers, standing on foundations that had been poured in the 1890s, anchored by bolts that had been rusting for a century by the time the wind found them. The bridge that fell was twice built, a structure that carried within it the memory of two constructions, two sets of workers, two moments in the history of American engineering. But the original bridge, the bridge that Chanute designed and Bonzano supervised and 120 unnamed men assembled in 94 days, that bridge was gone long before the tornado came. It was dismantled in 1900. The iron was scrapped. The pin connections were pulled apart and melted down for other uses. What survived from 1882 was the stone piers, the concrete foundations, and the documentary record, incomplete as it was. What survived was the engineering news account, the cost summary, and two names in a coroner's docket. The 1900 rebuild would change the bridge completely. The steel structure that replaced the iron structure was heavier and stronger, designed to carry loads that the original bridge could never have supported. The trains that crossed the Kinzua Viaduct in 1950 were not the trains that crossed it in 1882, because the loads were different, the speeds were different, and the economics of coal transport had shifted in ways that the men who built the original bridge could not have imagined. But the foundations remained, and the piers remained, and the anchor bolts that connected the steel towers to the concrete beneath them remained in place, rusting slowly, year by year, decade by decade, until the day in July 2003, when the wind came and the rust gave way. The men who built the 1882 bridge did not know that their work would be dismantled in 18 years. They did not know that the iron they riveted together at 200 feet would be pulled apart and replaced with steel before the new century began. They knew only the work in front of them, the deadline closing in, the traveller rolling forward, the rivets glowing cherry red in the forge. They knew the springboard planks and the hemp lines and the sound of the hammer against iron. They knew the two men who fell. They knew what it cost to build a bridge in 94 days. The 1900 rebuild happened because the bridge was dying. The bridge wasn't failing in any dramatic sense. It wasn't collapsing or cracking. The wrought iron that Chanute had specified in 1882 was doing exactly what wrought iron does under repeated stress. It was fatiguing. The microscopic fibres within the metal were separating slowly, invisibly, under loads that the original design had never anticipated. In 1882, a freight locomotive weighed perhaps 40 tons. By 1900, the same Erie Railway was running engines that weighed 70 tons, 80 tons, machines that would have seemed impossible to the men who stood on the springboards 18 years earlier. The bridge that had been the tallest railroad structure in the world was now an engineering problem. It could not carry the future that the railroad needed it to carry. The Erie Railway's chief engineer in 1900 was a man named C.W. Buchholz. His name appears in the company records, in the engineering specifications, in the contracts that authorized the work. Unlike the 120 men who built the original bridge, Buchholz left a documentary trail. He understood what needed to happen. The iron towers would have to come down and steel towers would replace them. The masonry piers, the stone foundations that the 1882 crews had laid before the iron went up, those would remain. The piers were sound. The concrete was sound. What had changed was the metal, and the metal could be changed again. The Elmira Bridge Company won the contract. Work began on May 24, 1900, 18 years and 2 weeks after the original construction had started. The crew numbered somewhere between 100 and 150 men, depending on which account you trust. They worked through the summer, dismantling the iron structure that had stood since 1882, pulling the pins that those earlier crews had driven, lowering the columns that had been raised by the erecting traveller. The iron went to scrap. It was melted down, recast, turned into other things. The physical substance of the 1882 bridge, the actual metal that the unnamed workers had touched and shaped and riveted, ceased to exist as a bridge and became raw material for whatever the foundries needed next. In its place rose steel, open hearth steel, a different metallurgy entirely, produced by a process that had barely existed when the original bridge was built. The new towers were heavier. The new structure weighed 6.7 million pounds, more than double the 3.1 million pounds of the original iron viaduct. The dimensions remained the same, 2,053 feet long, 301 feet high, because the piers remained the same. But the bridge itself was new, a different structure standing on the same foundations, carrying the same railroad across the same valley, serving the same economic purpose. The name remained, and the location remained, but the bridge, in every material sense, did not. The new steel structure opened for traffic on September 25, 1900. The project had taken 105 days, 11 days longer than the original construction. The men who built the steel bridge are no better documented than the men who built the iron bridge. Their names do not appear in the records that survive. The pattern held. The railroad recorded what it needed to record: costs, timelines, engineering specifications, the weight of the steel and the diameter of the pins. The men who did the work remained a labour category, not a collection of individuals. But there was one difference in the 1900 rebuild that would matter a century later. The new steel towers sat on the original foundations, and the original foundations were anchored by the original bolts. The iron anchor bolts that the 1882 crews had set into the concrete, the bolts that held the first towers in place, those bolts were not replaced. They were reused. The steel towers of 1900 stood on iron anchors from 1882, two metallurgies joined together, two eras of engineering connected at the base. Someone noticed. A railroad man, his name not recorded, looked at the plans or looked at the work in progress and made a prediction. Someday during a severe storm or tornado, he said, that bridge will go down. The quote survives in the historical record, attributed to no one in particular, a piece of anonymous foresight that would take 103 years to prove correct. The man who said it understood something that the engineers either did not understand or chose to ignore. Iron and steel age differently. They rust at different rates. They respond to stress in different ways. Connecting them at the most critical point in the structure, the point where the towers met the earth, was a decision that traded present convenience for future risk. The rebuilt viaduct carried trains for 59 years. The Erie Railway ran freight across it until 1959, when the economics of rail transport shifted again and the line was discontinued. The bridge stood empty after that, a structure without a purpose, maintained by no one, visited by hikers and photographers who came to see the tallest railroad bridge that no longer carried trains. The state of Pennsylvania acquired the site in 1963 and turned it into Kinzua Bridge State Park. The bridge became a monument to itself, a tourist attraction, a place where people could walk out onto the deck and look down 301 feet into the valley below. For 40 years the steel bridge stood in the park. The anchor bolts rusted, the pins corroded. The structure that had been built for motion, for the dynamic stress of locomotives crossing at speed, now stood in stillness, which is its own kind of stress. Metal that moves stays limber, but metal that sits grows brittle. The bridge was aging in ways that no one was measuring, because no one was responsible for measuring it. The state maintained the deck. The state maintained the approaches. The anchor bolts, buried in concrete, invisible, were not part of anyone's inspection routine. July 21, 2003 was a Monday. The weather that afternoon was unstable, the kind of summer atmosphere that breeds thunderstorms in the Allegheny Highlands. At 3:15 in the afternoon, an F1 tornado touched down in the Kinzua Creek Valley. The wind speed was somewhere between 94 and 112 miles per hour, strong enough to strip shingles from roofs and snap tree branches, not strong enough to level buildings or overturn cars. An F1 is a minor tornado by the standards of the Great Plains. It is not the kind of storm that destroys bridges. But the Kinzua Viaduct was not a building or a car. It was a structure designed to resist vertical loads, the weight of locomotives pressing down through the towers into the foundations. It was not designed to resist horizontal loads, the sideways force of wind pushing against the open lattice of the steel columns. The tornado hit the bridge broadside. The wind found the anchor bolts. The anchor bolts, 121 years old, iron in a steel structure rusted through at the base, gave way. 11 towers fell in 11 seconds. The collapse began at the south end and propagated north, each tower pulling the next as the pin connections did exactly what pin connections do. They transferred force. They spread the failure from one section to the next. The towers did not crumble or shatter. They fell as units, still connected at the pins, still holding their shape as they dropped 225 feet into the valley below. The remaining 9 towers, the ones whose anchor bolts held, stood at the north end of the viaduct, connected to nothing, a row of steel columns ending in empty air. The tornado that destroyed the Kinzua Viaduct was on the ground for less than a minute. It travelled perhaps half a mile before it dissipated, and the damage it caused, other than the bridge, was minimal. A few trees down, some debris scattered across the hillsides. The storm was not remarkable, but the destruction was. A structure that had stood for 121 years, that had been called the 8th wonder of the world, that had carried thousands of trains across a valley that no other engineering solution could have crossed, was reduced to wreckage in the time it takes to count to 11. The news coverage focused on the bridge. The photographs showed the twisted steel, the fallen towers, the gap in the structure where 11 sections had stood that morning and now lay in the valley below. What the coverage did not mention, because the coverage did not know, was the distinction that mattered. The bridge that fell was not the bridge that was built in 1882. The bridge that fell was the steel replacement, the 1900 structure, 101 years old on the day the tornado came. The Iron Bridge, the bridge that Chanute designed and Bonzano supervised, and 120 unnamed men assembled in 94 days, that bridge had been gone for a century. It had been dismantled and scrapped and melted down before anyone alive in 2003 was born. The tornado destroyed the second bridge. The memory it evoked was the first. After the collapse, the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources faced a decision. The fallen towers lay in the valley, 11 sections of steel lattice scattered across the forest floor, still connected at the pins, still holding the shape they had held when they stood. The state could remove them. It could hire crews to cut the steel apart and haul it out of the valley, to clear the wreckage and restore the site to something like its natural condition. It could treat the collapse as a disaster to be cleaned up, an embarrassment to be erased. The state chose not to. The decision, documented in the DCNR's interpretive plan for Kinzua Bridge State Park, published in 2011, was to leave the wreckage where it fell. The fallen towers would remain in the valley. They would become part of the site, part of the story, part of what visitors came to see. The ruin would be preserved as a ruin. The choice was not sentimental. It was interpretive. The collapsed towers told a story that the standing towers could not tell. They showed what happens when metal fails. They showed how a pin-connected structure comes apart, each section still joined to the next, the engineering logic visible even in destruction. They showed the scale of the thing, the weight of it, the height from which it fell. A visitor standing next to a fallen column, looking up at the twisted lattice of steel, could understand the bridge in a way that a visitor standing on the deck never could. The ruin made the structure legible. Today, visitors to Kinzua Bridge State Park can walk out onto the Kinzua Skywalk, a glass-floored observation platform built on the remaining 9 towers at the north end of the viaduct. They can stand 225 feet above the valley floor and look south, across the gap where the 11 towers once stood, to the trees on the far side. They can look down through the glass and see the forest below, the creek winding through the valley, the wreckage of the fallen towers scattered among the trees, and they can hike down into the valley. A trail leads from the parking area to the forest floor to the place where the towers came to rest. The steel lies where it landed. The columns are bent but not broken. The pin connections, the same pin connections that the 1882 crews drove and the 1900 crews reused, still hold the sections together. The structure that fell as a unit lies as a unit, a monument to the engineering that built it and the rust that destroyed it. The valley is quiet. The creek runs over rocks that were there before the bridge and will be there long after the last of the steel has rusted away. The forest has begun to reclaim the wreckage, vines climbing the lattice, moss growing on the horizontal surfaces, the slow, patient work of decay that will eventually reduce the steel to oxide and the oxide to soil. The process will take centuries. The bridge that took 94 days to build will take 300 years to disappear. Standing in that valley, next to columns that fell 225 feet and landed with enough force to drive themselves into the earth, a visitor confronts a particular kind of absence. The men who built the original bridge in 1882 left no names. The men who rebuilt it in 1900 left no names. The railroad man who predicted the collapse left no name. The tornado that brought the towers down had no witnesses, no one standing in the valley at 3:15 on that Monday afternoon to watch the steel come apart. The collapse happened in solitude. 11 seconds of destruction, with no one there to see it. The parallel is not accidental. The bridge was built by men whose individual existence the railroad did not bother to record. It fell in a moment that no individual witnessed. The two absences rhyme. The valley holds both of them, the unrecorded labour of 1882 and the unwitnessed destruction of 2003, and it holds them equally, without preference, without judgment. The ground does not care about names. The ground receives what falls and keeps it. The coroner's docket in Smethport, the one that records the 2 deaths during the original construction, is still there. The names are still legible. 2 men who fell from the springboards, who died doing rivet work at 200 feet, who were buried somewhere in McKean County in graves that may or may not still be marked. Their names survived because death required documentation. Their lives, their work, their skill with a rivet hammer or a forge, none of that survived. They exist in the record as casualties, not as craftsmen. The 118 men who did not fall are not in the docket. They are not anywhere. They finished the bridge and collected their wages and walked away into lives that left no trace in the documentary record. Some of them probably worked on other bridges, other railroad projects, other structures that required men willing to stand on planks at 200 feet and catch rivets thrown from below. Some of them probably went back to the coal mines, to the lumber camps, to the farms and factories that employed men who could work with their hands. Some of them probably died young, because men who did that kind of work often did. None of that is recorded. None of that can be known. What can be known is the bridge. What can be known is the iron that became steel, that became rust, that became wreckage. What can be known is the valley, the creek, the forest, the fallen towers lying where they landed. The men who built the bridge are gone. The bridge they built is gone. The bridge that replaced it is half gone. 9 towers standing and 11 towers fallen, a structure that exists now only as a ruin and a memory. The last train crossed the Kinzua Viaduct in 1959. The tornado came in 2003. The skywalk opened in 2011. The timeline is simple, but the meaning is not. A bridge is a solution to a problem, and the problem was a valley. 301 feet deep, 2,053 feet wide, standing between the coal fields and the markets that needed coal. The solution was iron, then steel, then rust, then wreckage. The solution worked for 121 years, if you count from the original construction, or 101 years if you count from the rebuild. It worked until it didn't, until an F1 tornado found the weakness that a railroad man had predicted a century before, and 11 towers fell in 11 seconds, and the valley received what the valley had always been waiting to receive. The men who built the bridge are in that valley now. Not literally, not their bones or their remains. But their work is there. The steel that replaced the iron that they riveted lying on the forest floor still connected at the pins. The structure they made possible, the solution they assembled in 94 days, rests in the place it was built to cross. The valley won. The valley always wins. The bridge was a temporary argument against gravity, and gravity is patient, and rust is patient, and wind is patient, and the valley collects what falls and keeps it and does not record the names. The glass floor of the skywalk is transparent. Visitors stand on it and look down and see the valley, 225 feet below, the creek and the trees and the wreckage of the towers. They do not see the men who built the bridge, because there is nothing to see. No photographs, no payroll ledgers, no list of names. The men existed for 94 days in the summer of 1882, and then they dispersed, and the bridge stood, and the bridge fell, and the valley holds what remains. 2 names in a coroner's docket, 11 towers on the forest floor. The record begins there and ends there, and everything else is silence.